All good, thank you.
Thank you very much, Larry. Right. Obviously, you missed that first gems of wisdom I said, but obviously, as long as we get the 4 main speakers recorded, that will be absolutely great. So, welcome everybody, but also, first of all, thanks to everybody. Obviously, thanks for joining us this morning, but also thanks as yet all sort of local wildlife site owners. You've got your land, so thank you from us, and a thank you from your wildlife for looking after your land over there over the last year, because there's this network of 400 odd sites that all add up to far more than all our nature reserves put together, and you are all collectively managing that land for the wildlife, and it's hugely important. And as they're all spread out across Gwent, they form this connectivity across, so you're all sort of vital cogs in sort of wildlife conservation within Gwent. So thank you very much. And also finally, a thank you to NRW, who are funding this event this year through the Resilient Communities Fund. So thank you very much to NRW as well. So just a quick sort of update of our local wildlife site work over the last year. The last 3 years, we had funding through the NRAW project, which finished, I think, July last year. So we managed to create a further 90 local wildlife sites across Gwent, which just further strengthens the network I was just talking about. So to any of you new people who have local wildlife sites through the NRAW project, welcome to you. This may be the first Landowners Day you've come along to. And also we had funding from the Resilient Communities Fund again, which obviously funded this Landowners Day, but also funded the newsletter you should have all had. And then I'm pleased to say we've also secured funding for next year. Again, thank you to NRW through their Nature Networks Fund. So we will be resurveying and discovering new local wildlife sites in this year, 2023, and in 2024. So it will have said within your newsletter, but if you have a local wildlife site which we haven't resurveyed since 2015, we would love to hear from you, because we'd love to come out and resurvey your site for you if you would so like. I mean, do a fresh species list and sort of can give a bit extra advice on how to manage your land. So please get in touch with myself if you'd like your site resurveyed. So on to this morning. You've got me talking now, and then after that we have Cherry Taylor, who's very kindly agreed to talk. Cherry is the founder of Rewilding Monmouthshire Group and also the chair of Action for Climate Emergency Monmouthshire. And her talk this morning will be Rewilding in Monmouthshire, Making It Work for You. Then after that, I think on your invites, it will say Fraser Coonbert from the Mammal Society is doing a talk. Well, he's not. We now have Derek Crawley, who's very kindly standing in, but he is a great stand-in. Derek is the vice chair of the Mammal Society, and we've been doing lots of work with harvest mice over the last 20 years, so great replacement. And you can all go and have a cup of tea, refresh yourselves. Then there'll be myself talking about 10 species in Gwent. And after that, we have Sophie Lee Williams from the Durrell Wildlife Conservation Trust. We'll be talking about white-tailed eagles. And then after that, there'll be a little bit more for me. Then you can all go and have your Sunday lunch. So there we go. So I'm probably a little bit ahead of time there. But if Cherry is ready and available, oh, looks as if she is. So I think I've already kind of done Cherry's talk, but yes, say Cherry's the founder of Rewilding Monmouthshire Group, set up on Facebook, I think be about 2 years ago, something like that, but there's 500 more members. But I'm sure Cherry would welcome even more members, and it's a great group to be involved in. But I'm going to shut up now because Cherry's going to tell you all about it. So over to you, Cherry. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andy. I was thought I might have to ask you to stop going into more detail because I'm covering all that in my talk. Right, so I'll just share my screen. Hopefully this will work. Okay. Can everybody? Right.
We can see it, it's all good.
Great, that's what I need to know. Brilliant. Okay, so I'm Cherry Taylor. I have a science background, but I'm not an ecologist, but I'm very much a garden and nature enthusiast. And so I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about rewilding and what it's meant for me. Okay. Wait a minute, my next slide thing isn't working. Hold on a moment. Why would that be?
So
Sorry.
what have you tried to do? You've clicked
So I'm
next and it's
using
just
my
not.
usual keys that work on my laptop and it's not.
Ah, okay. Do you want me to try and get up the one you sent to me? And
Yeah, do you want to do that? And I'll just start talking.
okay,
Anyway.
yeah. If you knock off your screen share so that I can
Okay.
put mine on.
You just see there's nothing obvious. No. Okay, that's a shame. Okay, so we tested that the screen share worked, but we didn't test it further. So yeah, so Monmouthshire rewilding. So I'm going to talk about rewilding. So what is rewilding? So it's probably there's a lot of misconception about what it is, and you constantly hear people referring to it as something and then another person saying it's something else. And I think it's probably easier. So if we could have the next slide, please, Lauren. It's probably easier to tell you what it's not. The next slide again, thank you. Right, so it's not traditional species-specific conservation, which we're going to hear a lot about later in the morning. And it's not tree planting, nor is it wildflower meadows, regenerative agriculture, or sort of traditional wildlife gardening. And it's definitely not just land abandonment. Next slide, please, Laurie. So what is it? Rewilding is all about the restoration of natural processes. So this is basically seeing what turns up, sitting on your hands and letting nature take its course. And if I'm sure many of you will be familiar with this book by Isabella Tree, but this sort of catapulted the Knepp Estate into, and rewilding indeed, into sort of public consciousness, and it's become very well known now. And Knepp is really an iconic example. Next slide, please, Laurie. So if you've read the book, you'll know that Knepp is 3,500 acres. It's not all put in the rewilding programme. It was farmed for 17 years, and for only 2 of those years, they turned a profit. They were gradually pushed towards intensive agriculture using lots of chemical inputs. And in Charlie Burrell's own words, the soil was dead by the time they got to the end of 2000. Next slide, please, Laurie. So here is a picture of the Knepp countryside. Keep your eye on that body of water in the middle of the picture, because I'm going to show you this picture, this same shot in 2 decades time on from this. But this is very typical what we see of British countryside. That would be very familiar to us. Next slide, please, Laurie. So in 2001, they stopped farming and started rewilding, really out of needs must, because you know, they had the bank knocking at the door. And they were inspired by various rewilding initiatives in Europe and elsewhere. And they gradually got funding and added different bits of their farmland into the scheme. Next slide, please, Laurie. So this was 2 decades on, and you can see that body of water again as a marker, and you can see that the landscape is quite different. But you can still also see the outline of where the fields were. Next slide, please, Laurie. So what have they discovered? What's happened? What's changed? It's an exceptionally well-studied place. It's attracted lots of ecologists and scientists, and lots of studies and surveys have been done. And they've seen a gradual return of nature. And I've just listed some of the wonderful things that they've witnessed during the last 20 years. They've taken out all the Victorian infrastructure that was controlling the water and let that go where it wanted to go. They've also done some species reintroduction. And they are now turning a profit. Their turnover is about 800,000, but it's very diverse. It's not all from sort of the replacement ethical meat, but they are making money out of ethical meat. Next slide. So what's Knepp going to look like in the future? Now, again, just to reiterate, I'm not an ecologist, but I remember from A-level biology that if you abandon a piece of land or if you have a lava flow, there's a natural succession that takes place, ecological succession, and the climax is forest, basically. So will Knepp turn into forest? Next slide. The short answer is probably no. I should say definitely no, but the reason it won't is because of ecological disturbance. Now, I found this chart in actually in a gardening book by Nigel Dunnett, and who is an ecologist and a landscape gardener. And I thought, oh my God, that completely explains rewilding to me. And so you have biodiversity on the vertical and disturbance on the horizontal. And if what you're after is the sweet spot, the top of the curve, where you get the most variety and the most opportunity for species to coexist. So you want intermittent and regular episodes of disturbance. If you don't have that, if you just abandon the land and walk away, in our countryside today, brambles would take over, then trees would come up through it, etc., etc. It would be low biodiversity. And equally, if you have too high levels of disturbance, like ploughing or overgrazing, you would get low biodiversity again. Next slide. So why is Knepp not going to end up being a forest? Well, it's because of the animals which provide this ecological disturbance. And they have basically four different types. They've tried to mimic historically the animals that would have roamed freely in this country before we farmed it and put barriers everywhere and killed them all and ate them all. Next slide, please. So in May 22, a group of us from Monmouthshire decided we wanted to go and see this for ourselves. So we went and had a fantastic trip to Knepp and included some Gwent wildlife people, including Andy. Next slide. And here you can see, so we saw all the animals and we saw the landscape and we saw what was going on. And basically the animals are outside all year, they eat what they want, they go where they want. There's no extra feeding, they're out all year and they form these social groups and they behave, I put natural inverted commas because they do have to do some management. For example, they don't want lots of interbreeding and things like that. So there is some control, but basically they're left, and they also take out, for example, bulls or that are showing signs of being too aggressive and things like that. So there is some intervention, but they try and keep it as natural as possible. And there's a classic phrase that Isabella Tree uses, which is different mouths do different jobs. And that's why you get this variety of habitats. Next slide. So here, this is a typical bit of scenery, habitat that you see in Knepp. So there's these great big mounds of brambles. And one of the things I wanted to know was, what keeps these brambles from just taking over? And you can see the quotes there from our guide on the safari. There's lots of things that eat brambles and nettles. Next slide. Here you can see some deer. They've got lots of different types of deer. You can see them resting in the shade there. So you get bits that still look like open pasture, bits that are woodland, and bits that are this thorny scrub. Next slide. You also see this an awful lot, where the regeneration or the natural growth of plants is being kept back by grazing. And this is, you see a lot of these little stubs of trees that are nibbled down. Next slide, please. And this is again thorny scrub, the typical thing. You can see little hummocks of I think that some of the species were suckering, but you know, nibbled back, being kept in its place by the grazing. Next slide. And before I went to Knepp, I'd given a rewilding talk for Rotary Monmouth, and a farmer there had said to me, "Oh, you see, Knepp will be nothing but blackthorn in 20 years." And I thought, I wonder if he's right. Let's go and have a look, see what's going on. And here's an old hedgerow with a bit of blackthorn in, and you can see it trying to creep like it does out, and it's just constantly nibbled and kept back. Next slide. We've also got pigs, which do a fantastic job at disturbance at a ground level with their rootling, and they're Tamworth pigs. You can see the picture on the right, the disturbance that they caused. That incidentally was under oak trees, probably not a coincidence. Next slide. So here's the pig disturbance close up, and what this does is it brings the seed bank up to the surface and gives opportunity for new plant species to germinate. And this really, so it's, the guide said this happens especially in the wet areas. This really illustrates that, you know, what you get if you were to do rewilding on your land would be governed by what's in the seed bank and what there is to come up and what's blown in from nearby. Next slide, please. There's more pig rootling there on the left. You can see a few different plant species there. And on the right is a pig's nest, which was rather cute. Next slide. So planting trees, there's been an awful lot of planting trees over the last few years. I dread to think how many were lost in last summer's heat wave, but this is what happens naturally. So I'm sure many of you will know this, that you have a clump of brambles which protects the young trees from being nibbled, and they grow up through, and that's how regeneration happens. And the idea is that the trees get so big that they shade out the brambles, which then diminish. So, and obviously this means no manual labor, no plastic guards, and no tree stakes needed. So from a planet point of view, that's pretty good going. Next slide. When I was there, Andy was looking at the different plant species, and I was quite surprised as well to see that it was quite limited in terms of, it seemed to be an awful lot of ragwort and an awful lot of fleabane. And I thought this was quite interesting, and I spoke to the guide about this and said, you know, it seems quite limited. And she said, well, it comes in peaks and troughs. So one year the ragwort will dominate, and then another year something else will dominate. I suppose in my mind, I'd gone there thinking I was going to see not pictorial, but a beautiful wildflower meadow, and it just wasn't. And of course it wasn't, because that's a man-made thing in this country anyway. Interesting point. I thought this was a great picture to show the horse poo next to the ragwort. So the horses completely leave it alone. Next slide, please, Laurie. Water was a really, really important element in all. It is a really important element in rewilding. Here they've got the very straight dikes that they used to have. The animals have broken down the sides and they're starting to re-wiggle and find their natural way. Next slide. There was lots of standing dead wood, fallen trees, and just so lovely to see them just lying there, because of course this is becomes another habitat in itself, the necrobiome, with all the species there. And next slide. And lots of standing dead wood, which are very popular with the birds. If you look closely at the top of that dead tree, you can see a white stork nesting. So that they seem to, lots of the birds seem to prefer perching on these dead trees. Maybe we just couldn't see the ones in the other trees, but they were very obvious up there. And the guide explained that this is a brilliant mechanism of seed dispersal, and it's actually quite hard to mimic. We did talk about possibly having kids do it, or maybe giving the adults some alcohol, and that might be able to mimic it. Next slide. We're doing for time, okay. So we have, so Knepp is basically a mosaic of different habitats, and it's constantly changing. And I think the guide explained that what you get is, in terms of habitat, is dependent on what the land was used for before. So whether it was permanent pasture or an arable field, and also when it was introduced into the scheme, because they didn't rewild everything all from the word, you know, the first time they started. They've gradually added over the years. So some have been in the rewilding project for a long time, and others have not. Next slide. So my impression of Knepp, my goodness, I've never seen so many rabbits. There were rabbits everywhere, and there were lots of corresponding birds of prey. It was really wonderful to see. Lots of evidence of disturbance, but it did need pointing out. They have 16 miles of footpath going through Knepp, which you can wander on, and lots of people do. But you could easily overlook, probably not if you're an ecologist, but for someone who's just not interested in rewilding, it did need pointing out. But there was lots of wood pasture, thorny scrub, and woodland edge, which is the sweet spot in terms of biodiversity. Next slide. So what does it mean for landowners like myself? So I've got an acre and a half. Next slide, please. So I've got an acre and a half, and I just want to share with you my experience of tackling my own little patch, and to see if that'll be helpful for anybody. Next slide. So this is my land. I'm near the Hendra near Monmouth, and this was taken in 2015, just before we moved in, and the land tapers off there to the right. It goes right up to the road. So in all, there's an acre and a half. Next slide. So when we moved in, so this is the bit off to the right. This is the field, as we still call it now. And it was not much in it, really, lots of docks. And it has, when we first moved in, for many years, we just mowed it, but didn't collect. We had a ride on, so it was nothing special. Next slide. Then we had ground source heating put in. So quite a lot of disturbance went on, and we had to have these 5 parallel trenches. So that was the next sort of big event in the field. Next slide. Around the house, put in lots of flowers. Next slide. And big veggie patch. Ended up running a small market garden, selling posh salad bags. Next slide. And then in winter, you might have to press the, yes, thank you. I had a seriously bad knee in 2021. I was off my feet for months, but I had 1.5 acres to look after, which was pretty devastating. So my thoughts were basically that I would either move house or indeed rewild it. So this was like, I jokingly said to my husband, oh, perhaps we could rewild it, and then thought, oh, hang on a minute, maybe I should look into this, because it's very expensive to move house. Next slide. So my objectives were twofold: to reduce the workload and to increase the biodiversity in my garden and the land. Next slide. And I thought, it can't just be me. I can't be the only one wanting to do this. And I looked up Rewilding Britain, and they were only interested in talking to you if you had ideally 250 acres, 100 acres, they might consider talking to you. And I just thought there must be lots of people like me with a few acres who want to do the best for biodiversity that they can. So I started up this Facebook group, Monmouthshire Rewilding. Please do join it if you are interested. I know some of you are already on it. And please participate and share your experiences. That's what people really want to see, is indeed why I'm here talking to you now. People really want to know what other people are doing. Next slide. So how have I gone about approaching rewilding in my garden? So I think it's really important to record your starting point. And because if you've got a special habitat, so like a wildflower meadow, native wildflower meadow, you know, that's pretty special, and you probably should, you know, that might be more important to preserve that than to go down the rewilding route. But if you haven't got anything special, my field wasn't anything special, want to let nature take the lead and see what comes. And to understand that disturbance is necessary. I used to get very upset about seeing disturbance anywhere, and now I'm like, oh, there's some tire tracks, not to worry, because that's disturbance. If you've got the space to use animals, but if not, like me, then you have to think about mimicking them. So just a little bit of cutting back here and there, a little bit of turning the ground over here and there. To what you're trying to do is create as many as varied habitats as possible. And if you're lucky enough to have natural water, then that's brilliant. Next slide. So I started to keep track of interesting species on the insect and animal front that I saw, and also birds. Birds are supposed to be quite a good indicator. This was by no means systematic or thorough, but you know, I didn't sit out there every day for once a month or something like that. This was just as and when I saw things and discovered things that were interesting. Next slide. I haven't got any natural water, but it has always been on the cards to put in a pond. So we escalated that project and put in a new pond. But there are lots of other things that I've discovered reading around that we could have done if we had natural water, like swales and creating boggy areas. Yes, and things like that. Next slide. So we have got in the field, we had, when we moved in, we had said, right, okay, let's have a mow strip, which you can see there on the left, to keep the hedgerow at bay, kind of thing was our idea back in the day. But we did put a 2-meter margin in, which doesn't look like it there, but that is 2 meters, and just let that do its own thing. So it's been great, and the hedgerow is now really a line of trees, but it's also got lots of it's got standing deadwood in, which is great. My husband was like, let's get rid of that, and I'm like, no, let's keep it. It's standing deadwood. And the birds do indeed perch on it. They're it's actually elms that have got to a certain height and then given up. And we've got lots of different species in the hedgerow. And just last year, so after 8 years, in its 8th year, I'm starting to see quite a nice mix of plants in that hedgerow margin. Next slide, please. There we are. It's a nice little close up there. You can see there's all sorts going on there. Next slide. But then in 2021, my husband came up with the idea of doing a shepherd's hut holiday let, and this really threw all of my rewilding plans out the window in the field. Well, not completely, but really it meant that because of the ground source heating, the field was like a corrugated tin in terms of dips where the trenches were, and we didn't feel we could have that if we were going to let out the shepherd's hut. So we got the whole field shallowly rotivated, and then decided to sow a wildflower meadow, which we did. Next slide, please. So summer 22, yes, actually that last picture was also 22 last year. So we got this new meadow. I had fantastic advice and seed from Habitat Aid, sourced via the Monmouthshire Meadows group website. Brilliant contacts on there, and got really good advice. So tall, skinny annuals to get some colour in the first year because of the shepherd's hut, but also the perennials are in there. So it looks like a pictorial meadow, but they are all natives. Next slide, please. And then in the autumn this year, a lot of wild carrot is left, just in the final throes there. This is quite late in the year. I'm desperately waiting in the wings to scythe it. But the birds, goldfinches, etc., fed off that for a long, long time. And once all the seed heads are gone, I did eventually get to scything it. Next slide, please. Other things, so I've had to read further afield than just rewilding. Lots of ecological and sustainable gardening books are coming up, and dead hedges are becoming a really big thing. It seems everybody's doing dead hedges, and why not? Because they're absolutely brilliant for wildlife. There's a couple here, and it saves me time. I don't have to process all the dead perennial stems from the flower garden, or worry about, you know, don't have to do any burning, or we don't need to use the recycling facilities of Monmouthshire. So lots of dead hedges. Next slide. Over time. And this one is a dead hedge nest, which I pinched the idea off Nigel Dunnett. And yeah, I won't go into detail unless anybody wants me to, but we've made the middle bit a bit different, copying the model of sort of Nigel Dunnett and James Hinchman. Next slide, please. So in my land, I've had to take a hybrid approach. It's definitely not purist rewilding. In fact, I'd say, apart from the field margins and the meadow going forward and the hedgerow, there's very little that I've been able to sort of sit on my hands and let go. But my focus is very firmly on increasing the biodiversity. So everything I do on my land is stop and think, what's going to be the impact on the wildlife and biodiversity. I've done a bit of tree planting. I've got an organic, I've got a wildflower meadow. It's all organic, no chemical, and it's definitely taken elements of wildlife gardening. And I've even got a few areas which are abandoned simply because I haven't had time to do anything with them. So it's a really mixed approach. Next slide. So in rewilding in Monmouthshire, so my vision for starting the group was that we might have a mixture of different properties. The next slide, please, actually. So my vision was that we might have pockets of land that are rewilded or maximized for wildlife in terms of biodiversity, and that they might link up. There might be some sympathetic farm owners that would leave a hedgerow linking up to rewilded gardens, or perhaps the occasional regenerative farm linking them together. And, you know, there's been a lot of talk about gardens being equal to the size of X amount of land, and how if all the gardens did this, it would be brilliant for wildlife. And I really doubt that that figure that is bandied about includes the land of a few acres that people on here have got. And I'm so pleased to hear that Gwent Wildlife Trust have got 400 such sites. I mean, that's so exciting. The potential is enormous. Next slide, please. This is Isabella Tree's vision, which I pinched off a talk that she gave. And you can see she's taken a bit of traditional British countryside, and she's put in some exciting features, the restored wetland in the lower right. There are land bridges, which we probably can't do on our own land, but there's also field margins and scrub land and things like this. So this is, it's the message is we could, you know, you can do both. It can be productive as well as good for wildlife, which is then moving into the regenerative farming space. Next slide, please. So my conclusions, next slide, please. So in terms of true rewilding, we know we can't turn the clock back to when we had free roaming large herbivores and predators. So we'll always have to have some intervention, especially, and I think the less land you have, the more intervention you'll have to do. Luckily, my knee's better now, so that's it's manageable. But I think it is a fantastic opportunity to see what comes and to encourage, to really think about the core fundamental principle of increasing biodiversity. So I would say make it your own, do what you can. And I just in the field, when I got round to scything the meadow, there were so many mouse little rodent nests in the cracks that the heat wave had produced. There was lots of evidence of mouse nests. And we've seen a kestrel arrive for the first time in late 2022. And obviously I'm taking full credit for that. Next slide, please. The end. Thank you very much. I think I'm on time. Thank you very much, everybody. And thank you, Lowry, for doing the slides.
No problem.
Thank you, Jerry. That was great. That was great to see the sort of the large scale at Knepp, and then the small scale, which is more achievable for what lots of people, be able to, particularly people who are here today. And I think 2 people joined Monmouthshire Rewilding group as the talk was going on there. So that's 2 people who are here today. So that's great. Now, do we have any questions? There seems to be that. I can't believe there's no questions, but you might get that off easily there. But if anybody does have any questions, please just type it in the chat, and we shall pass that on. But maybe we don't. There we go. No questions. Right. We're going to be running a little bit ahead of schedule here, but I guess that's okay because somebody else might run over. But
I'll ask a question.
Oh, go on then, Larry. Thank you.
So obviously Knepp is a slightly different case. It works on a much larger scale. Do we think it's worth like going and visiting that, or is it kind of, it's a great example, but not for something the sort of general public are going to be able to achieve? Are we much better off sort of joining the Facebook group and seeking out resources that are more sort of tailored towards small scale landholdings and gardens and things like that?
I think it depends how much land you've got. I mean, I've only got 1.5 acres, and that includes the bit I've already turned into garden. So I haven't got very much land at all. I'm really right at the bottom end of that spectrum, really. And I think Knepp is a fantastic place to go. The campsite is brilliant, and to wake up and hear and just see the storks flying over your campsite, and
nightingale singing you to sleep.
Yeah, the nightingale singing you to sleep. It really is fantastic. And you can just go and wander off on the footpaths at any time and go and just take it all in. And there's guides, there's volunteer guides all along the paths, and they're so well informed as well. I would love to go back. And of course, they have also rewilded the walled garden now, which wasn't done when we went. So I think if you can make a pilgrimage to Knepp, I would do it. But one of the other things that I'm trying to find time to get off the ground is a wild and wonderful garden scheme for starting maybe in Monmouthshire, where a category would be rewilded gardens. And so, hopefully there will be lots to see locally too. And if anybody wants to join in that, please let me know.
Yeah, that would be really great to have some examples closer to home that people can visit and get sort of inspired and pick up on certain ideas. Because I think, a lot of our local wildlife site owners have probably already got very specific habitats that are fantastic for wildlife. And we wouldn't want a complete sort of rewilding approach in those habitats. But everyone's probably got those little areas around the land that could have a bit more of that approach applied to them. So yeah, I think having some examples that apply locally would be fantastic. So yeah, it'd be nice if there was a bit of an active group in future, and it could even involve tours and visits to people's land. That sounds like a great idea. I think we've got some questions coming through now, actually.
You've opened the floodgates there, Larry.
That always tends to happen. I think it just needs one question to get it going. So can you see those?
How best to mimic grazing?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because Isabella Tree says different mouths do different jobs, and there's been some really interesting studies about how the horses will take one length of grass and cows will take another, etc. But I'm just periodically just mow bits of grass. I mean, that's what I would do.
What else we got? Can people join the Rewilding group if they're not on Facebook?
It is a Facebook group, so there's no supporting email. It's not anything other than a Facebook group, I'm afraid.
Right. Yeah.
But maybe we do. I mean, we do work with you guys, Gwent Wildlife Trust. You know, you support us on it, which is wonderful. So maybe, I don't know, maybe that's something we could think about.
Yeah, we could give that some thought. But at the moment, it's all on Facebook. But obviously, we wouldn't want to exclude people who aren't on Facebook. Obviously, you could join Facebook, but Facebook isn't for everybody. Right, how many thistles and brambles per acre on a small site of old rough grassland? Pollinators and goldfinches love them, but they spread very quickly. When do we say enough is enough?
Yeah, it's really tricky, isn't it? I mean, the whole thing about disturbance is that it keeps the thugs at bay. So now my field is in its second year, and I can already see that I've got nettles, patches of little seedlings of nettles coming up, which had their first year last year. So if I don't get them out this year, you know, they'll be they might proliferate. Likewise, there's a lot of different species of thistle, and I think take some of them out. This is where the management comes in, that you do have to do something, and the smaller the space you've got, the more you have to do. So I'll be taking some of my thistles out and going through and taking some of the nettles out and things like that. So it's not actually, I was hoping it would be considerably less work, but actually I probably just made even more work for myself.
The smaller your area of land, probably the more work it needs. You've got a huge area, you can afford to let whole fields go and more this mosaic, but it's Joe, who's our senior conservation grazer officer, has said our Wisewood Reserve is heading this way. That's up at Penalt, so if anyone can go at any time and sort of see our work, sort of rewilding Wisewood if people want to. Various people have said thank you, Jerry.
Thank you.
And then they've asked, do the Knepp Estate cull their animals for commercial purposes?
Sorry, does it?
Do they cull their animals for commercial purposes?
Yes, they do. They keep because of, so they do, and they have quite a profitable bit of the business that is ethical meat that they sell to top restaurants, and also they're setting up their own restaurant, and they have a shop, etc., etc. So I can't remember the detail, because not being a farmer, I didn't pay much attention to all the questions on the safari about the animals, because I knew I was never going to have any on my land. But there is quite a bit about that on their website. You can go and have a look.
It's all good, because that obviously makes the whole project sustainable, and that some of that money gets ploughed back into the conservation. So it's a viable thing to make the whole project work, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Right, I think that is the end of the questions, apart from a few more thank yous, and I shall add a thank you to that as well. That's that was great. Thanks for that. And hope
Pleasure.
A few more members and so a bit more rewilding going on, and everything's good. So I think we have Eric next. Eric's
hello.
Yeah, so we got Derek. I said that he's the vice chair of the Mammal Society, and has recently written, I'm gonna have to read this up here, the Mammal Society's the Atlas of the Mammals of Great Britain and Northern Ireland 2020. So it's a pretty important book, and we've got the author of it here today, so we're pretty lucky. So if you could crack on the National Harvest Mouse Survey, a South Wales perspective. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. As this is a talk that's actually been put together by my colleague, who unfortunately is ill, and I've just stepped in at the last minute. So if I can't remember exactly what's happening on each slide, I apologise in advance. But this is who we are. So we're the Mammal Society. We started in 1954 national charity specialising in British mammal conservation, in the hope of trying to bring together academic citizen science as well as local groups. So that's your amateur naturalist, which is what I am at the moment. I'm not a scientist, but I have got a huge enthusiasm for mammals and mammal recording. And mammal recording is something we want to promote to all of you. So I hope that Cherry, that you were recording all those species rather than just in the book, but more formally. And also we're about providing scientific evidence for conservation, which is what we want to talk to you a little bit about today, on what we found when we started looking at harvest mice. So this is the character we want to talk about. Not many people have seen one, and that's part of the problem. They are one of our smallest rodents. They are this nice russet colour on top with a white underneath, bluntish nose, small eyes, and smallish ears. The interesting thing about them is that they have what's called a prehensile tail. So this tail, as you can see in the picture, wraps round vegetation and acts like a fifth limb. And they use that to actually help to anchor themselves as they reach between the stalks of grass species, so that they can actually pull together the leaves from different stalks, shred them, and then make a nest from them. They also use it as an anchor when they're actually moving down through the stalk, so they don't just slip through. What they eat shows that they're mostly herbivorous, although there is a small percentage of insects and that comes in mostly towards the late summer to try and bring up their body weight for winter. Being a small rodent, they are attacked by a variety of different species. Most of the carnivores will eat them. So that's foxes, stoats, weasels, polecats, as well as cats themselves. Our grass snake and adder fraternity will also have their fair share. And from the bird side, anything from barn owls, tawny owls, kestrels, buzzards will also have them as a quick snack. Simply, I say a snack on a simple basis, is that their calorific value is quite low, as opposed to some of the other animals you'll find in the grassland habitats, things like field voles, which are about 4 or 5 times the calorific value. What's their distribution? Well, you can see it's really quite large. They do go through all those grassland areas, but even across this range, a lot of people don't know what the actual distribution or numbers are. It's a secretive animal. If we look at the UK only, so the map in the middle is from the current atlas, and it pulls together different data. So the map on your left is the black and white one, is from the last atlas that was produced. The one in the middle shows a combination of both. So you have the red triangles are from the last survey, and then the darker green triangles are from this current survey period, which is from 2000 to 2016. And then all the other green is where they've actually situated in both surveys. And then the one on the right basically gives a rough distribution of where we can actually find these mice. But I just want to draw your attention back to the map in the middle, and you can see exactly where the harvest mice in Wales can be found, both historically and currently. And we're not doing too badly, but that's partly because you've got to look at these atlases in a different light. This isn't necessarily where the animals are, it's where people have found them and people have looked. So when we actually go further north into Scotland, where they are believed, and this has been reported in several books, that harvest mice aren't present, we then look at the fact that you can see two clear records in southern Scotland. And the record that you can't quite see is that right at the very top, I don't know if my mouse can actually show you that, there's one record right on the north coast. So if they're there, why aren't they in the middle? And then that becomes a question of, is it just because people haven't been looking because they're not thought to be there? And that becomes the issue. So we have gone back and looked a little bit harder in Scotland, and we have gone back in this last 2 years to look a little bit harder in Wales to try and find out the actual population and distribution that we've got. How do we get these records? There's a variety of different methods. If you're lucky, you'll actually see one. Now you can either just happen to be lucky and one runs past the vegetation or through the vegetation in front of you, but that is very, very rare. Or you can actually set up one of these feeding boxes that we use for small mammals, and the mice will actually come in and you'll get a clear photograph of them. You could find them in bird pellets, but they can be quite difficult because the skulls are quite weak, and therefore they don't always come back as an intact. But it is a case, if you can find a jawbone, then you actually pull their teeth out and they've got 5 root canals, which is a very characteristic identification feature. You might be unlucky and have some brought in by cats, and therefore we get dead records, but it's still useful to know that they're there. The cats themselves don't tend to impact the population because they tend to eat or catch mostly males, and in rodents, one male will basically service several females. So unless you're taking females, you're not really going to affect the population that badly. You can put out feeding tubes and either look for footprints, or you can actually pick up their droppings, as you can be seen here. We can put out live traps, which tend to be up in the vegetation. When we started doing this, we actually managed to catch wood mice, field voles, bank voles, common shrews. We didn't catch any harvest mice. In fact, I've only ever caught harvest mice from ground live traps rather than actually at the height there. We've tried some more novel ways, which is using sound. There's now a BTO sound acoustic that you can look at for recording sounds out and about, and harvest mice have been picked up on those. You can use thermal imaging to actually find the nests because they're slightly warmer than the rest of the surrounding vegetation. We have one person who's trying to train their dog to actually detect harvest mice, and this is just some of the training that went on. Having said that, when they've been out and about, although they found nests that humans haven't, humans have also found nests that the dog hasn't. But our main method is to look for used nests. So these are breeding nests found in vegetation where the stems are relatively close together. So these are either tall grasses, including reeds, or it's tussock grasses where the tussock itself forms a nice close bond, so that the animals can actually pull the leaves together and make this living grass nest. As it goes through the seasons, it changes colour with the surrounding vegetation, and therefore makes it a little bit like a needle in a haystack to try and find those nests. When the Mammal Society carried out their State of British Mammals, published in 2018, we worked out that there was a declining population that was estimated at just short of 800,000 in 95, and it went down to about 5.5. 5,500,000 in 2016, and therefore it was classified under as a near threatened species across the whole of Britain. But then we also looked at it within Wales, and we looked at it within England and Scotland, and in Scotland it is on the extension on extensions, therefore it's red listed. In Wales it is near threatened, again because of what we found. However, all this evidence that we used was looking at occupancy. So was it in a particular square rather than density? We don't know how many harvest mice live in an area. We can only really find that out if we started to radio track animals and everything else that goes with it, which is something that we're looking to do in the future, to try and work out a density within an acre of grassland. So basically, within the atlas here, we worked out that there was a reduction in hactads with the presence of harvest mouse, 92 in between 1960 and 92, and between 2000 and 2016. So we were considering that the animal is in the decline, or was it a case of people weren't looking and we weren't getting the records in? And here you can see the decline there. So it seems to be a reasonable to suggest that the animal's under some sort of threat, but it's a difficult one to be precise, which is why we decided to run a national harvest mouse survey, trying to get local people to go out to their local area and search for harvest mice. Now, this isn't an easy thing to do. I've always been interested in mammals from an early age, and it wasn't until about 20 years ago that I found my first harvest mouse nest. I'd been looking, but I just didn't have a clue of how to go about it. So I actually went on a training course with another local mammal group. They showed me how they found harvest mice. The next weekend, I went out to a national nature reserve in Staffordshire, where I live, and we found harvest mice within the first 20 minutes. They'd never been recorded at that site before. And this is the importance of trying to do these surveys, is that we need to teach people how to actually carry out the surveys in order to actually record their presence. So the question comes is where and when to survey. And it's all about trying to find grasses where the harvest mouse can actually reach between and grab hold of different stalks to make this nest. The when is because they are breeding nests, we don't want to do it in the breeding season. So we tend to say October through to about March is the winter period where the animals have come out of the stalk level of grasses and gone down to ground level where they make nests. They don't hibernate, they're active all the way through, but they actually make individual nests about the size of a golf ball at ground level. By looking at these taller vegetations, therefore we're not going to disturb breeding nests, and therefore we can work out presence and absence within that. But we can't work out density because the females make a new nest every time they breed, and the breeding cycle is about 6 weeks between nests. So it's not an easy one within that. The places that we look are areas where you're going to have these either tussock grasses, or you're going to have tall grasses that grow up against the structure, and therefore you can it's an ideal habitat for those harvest mice. So field margins are quite useful, whether they be grasses growing up through bramble and through the lower sections of hedgerows, or down a ditch, or even just a bit of rough grass in between two different fields. So set aside area is quite commonly used as the grasses come through. Or it could just be road verges where the grass isn't cut on a regular basis, that brings in these more perennial grasses, these tussock grasses, that come in, or it could be again looking down here. You've got a little bit of reedbed, a little bit of Phragmites, or a little bit of reed canary grass, because a little bit on the damp side. But again, even just before that, you can see this much thicker grasses rather than that cut section. Anywhere where there's water, you do tend to get the taller vegetations, whether it be say reed canary grass, Phragmites, even soft rush and some of the sedges. They're all quite good places to actually find harvest mice, as well as many other species. And if we go on to the tussocks, again, I'm not very good at some of my idents within this, but you can see there's a sedge down on the bottom that works out quite nicely. You have to be a little bit careful when surveying for that one, because you tend to cut your hands on the actual edges. You've got, I think it's Melania at the top there for that that wood rush, and I'm not sure what the other one is down here, but it could well be Cotsfoot on those areas. And again, if we go across into woodlands, it's again anywhere where you've got these taller vegetations. Once again, the animals will move in to go with it. Now, traditionally, we've always said sort of cornfields, but what happens there is that in the past, when we hand sowed, the stalks used to grow close to each other and fall onto each other, giving an ideal habitat. But with the current method of actually sowing them with a machine, they have their own particular space, and you don't always get the chance for that leaves to actually move across and easily contacted. So we don't tend to find them in modern agricultural fields, but you do on the edges of those areas and in quite some diverse habitats, including things like elephant grass. So in order to actually look at what we do within this, what we suggest is you have stout footwear, possibly wellies if you're going into the wetlands, a pair of gloves so you're not going to catch your hands on those sharp bits of vegetation from the sedges or on bits of bramble, thistles, nettles as you search through that vegetation. Quite a lot of people like to bring a stick because they like to use the stick to actually move the vegetation apart. And what you're basically doing is you're going to comb through the different stalks so that you can look in between them and try to find this tennis ball sized nest. The tape measures there because quite often we want to get some extra data on where the nest is, so we can work out what height of vegetation they prefer and whereabouts in that vegetation they tend to put the nest. We've got some indication already. It tends to be about 3/4 the way up on the taller vegetations, and it's about it's just above in the middle of the tussocks for tussock grasses. Although you can undertake surveys on your own, it's much more fun with people, simply because more effort in looking, but also as soon as somebody finds one, we all tend to rush over, have a look and work out, well, why couldn't I find that? And as you can see from the 4 pictures of nests that are in this one, they're not always easy to see. They do tend to blend in that little bit, and it is definitely a case of get your eye in. On the top right, you can see this is just in a little bit of Phragmites, and it was just a case of we separated those stalks out, and there's the nest just all sitting there nice and easy without any worries at all. Whereas the one that directly below it is in Cotsfoot, and again you have to separate out those stems, and it just sits on top of the tussock. And then I think got reed sweetgrass with it just being held in between the twos, and one of the sedges again, just spread those out and you find. Now the nests are actually connected to the vegetation so they don't fall out of place, unlike those that you find for birds. They tend to fall out as the seasons go on. Harvest mice nests tend to stay there without too much difficulty. The nests themselves are fairly typical. They tend to be about this tennis ball size. You don't always see holes in them. In fact, when they're actually active, the animal just pushes through that vegetation. It's only you get a hole once all the animals have left and they haven't sort of covered over that area again. In the vicinity of these grasses, you tend to find that the leaves in the vicinity have been shredded. And you can see that with the pictures on the right-hand side. And these shreds are important because they help to actually weave that ball together and make it a solid ball. So that when you hold it in your hand, one, it's attached to the vegetation, two, it doesn't fall apart and it stays a ball. And that's quite important as one of the identifying features of a harvest mouse nest. So there are some simple questions as you go through to go with it. Is it made of woven pieces of grass? Is it the size of a tennis ball? Okay. And therefore you can move forward within that. And you can find this on our webpage if you need any help with it. If we look at some of the nests that we find that aren't harvest mice, but we still find them out in vegetation, then these are the ones we look at. Over on the left-hand side, you've got two pictures, one above the other. These are made out of small, short pieces of cut grass that are basically just piled together. The animal then goes inside and actually turns around, so it can look quite like a ball because it is held within that vegetation. But when you pick them up and sort of wobble it in your hands, they tend to fall apart. And these tend to be made from field voles, or made by field voles, which just bring a clump together. Sometimes wood mice will do the same, but they tend to bring in lots of other vegetation rather than just grass. The two in the middle are actually dormice nests and tend to be slightly bigger than this tennis ball size. The one on the top is actually made and held onto the top of a hawthorn hedge. So although it's got mostly grasses in there and it's definitely woven and they've got splits within them, because it's not attached to actual grass stems, it pushes you down the line to more think about dormice than it does about harvest mice. The one at the bottom there is a winter harvest mice nest, dormouse nest. And this is basically found on the ground. This was underneath a load of bramble that was being cleared, and they found this nest. And it's clearly a nice woven ball, quite compact, but it's far too big for a harvest mouse. You haven't got that many shreds on the outer sides of this, but that's what we know turned out to be a dormouse nest. And it was handled by a licensed handler, and it was about the first one they found as a winter nest. And then the one on the right, you've got something in amongst that vegetation, and it's difficult to say exactly what it is from the size and everything else, because you can see it's really quite large, and we haven't actually decided what that nest is. And we couldn't find any additional evidence of being droppings or anything else to give us a clue. But we do know that occasionally field voles and bank voles will actually go up into vegetation and make platforms of just loose grass within the taller vegetation. That again, once it comes out, it doesn't have any form, and it soon just disappears and comes out of your hands. It just falls apart. When we're looking at where to and how to record these, we basically want a site name, a location, a grid reference or latitude and longitude, a date, the number of people that were looking, the predominant habitat, as well as then duration of the survey and the number of nests that people have found. And this then goes on to be a little bit extra information of whether or not you provided a photograph. They always help our verifier say that's definitely a harvest mouse nest. The colour of the nest, the diameter, the height above ground, the vegetation height, and what type of vegetation it was in, and any additional comments. This just helps us build up a bigger picture so that we can turn around after the two surveys that we've conducted on a national basis and say, on the whole, they prefer to be in this vegetation at this height, the vegetation is so tall, etc. Now that information really comes down almost on a county basis, because we have a little bit of differences through the counties. So if we go down to the southwest, then we're tending to look at set aside vegetation and edge of fields and hedgerows, and there they seem to prefer cotsfoot grasses that are of any age, but normally 2 to 3 years, but they will find them even in stuff that's been cut within a year, because the population is just current in that situation. If you come further north up to Staffordshire, we tend to find them more in reed canary grasses in wetland areas, but a lot of this, I have a feeling, is down to surveyor preference. Because we found them in that habitat before, we tend to look in that habitat again. Having said that, we found them in blackgrass on heathlands, we found them in wood rushes, we found them in soft rushes. So if the vegetation and the habitat is right, there's a good chance that you're going to have harvest mice in your area. So this is information about where you can find out about things. We've got the last year's survey results are up on our webpage. You can email us at surveys at the Mammal Society, or through Fraser at science at mammalsociety.org. We've got a up-to-date map of where people have been looking in the last 2 national surveys, and you can see we still need lots more people looking in your area. And if you want to encourage harvest mice, then it's looking at those tall grass vegetations that we're after. And it's interesting to know that from the Knepp Estate, they hadn't had any harvest mice for about 50 or 60 years once they started their Rewilding project, and in those habitats that are moving from the round the edges of the hedgerows, where you're tending to get this rough grass coming in, they've now got a good population of harvest mice. We know they're out there somewhere, we just need to find them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Derek. That was a great, very ably stood in there. That was great stuff. Again, we've got no questions. I'm going to kick things up this time. I was just that one that was right at the very north of Scotland. Is that a definite confirmed record? Is it?
It is. It's actually by one of my friends that went up there. Pictures and everything else. It was just in the edge of a plantation on very much moorland areas. I did go back last year, 2021, and did a quick run through the whole of Scotland trying to find harvest mice. I went to all the recorded sites we'd had from sort of 1950s onwards. There was about 11 sites across the whole of Scotland, and I didn't find any at all.
Right.
But having said that, later on and earlier that year, I found another 3 nests in totally new areas.
Right, so it shows if you go out there and look, then there's a possibility kind of thing.
There is. I mean, say one of the things that again comes up occasionally with this idea of rewilding is that people want to release harvest mice because they don't think they have any. Whereas we at the Society are basically saying you need to look, and you need to look hard first. And we actually suggest that you survey for 2 years before you consider any releases.
Right. But that was going to be my next question, was going to be asking about reintroductions. I know, I'm sure that's happened in Hereford, so they've just out across the border from us. And I know it was something we thought about on some of our places, but yeah, it's many reintroductions, you've got to make sure they're not there in the first place. It's something
well, I think
that
what we
the
need to do
Society
is
would support if it was fully backed by science.
Yeah, there's lots of people keep harvest mice. They breed like mice. And therefore, if you've got a male and a female, by the end of the season, you've probably got about 20, 30 mice if you're not careful. So people think, well, what do I do with them? And they just let them go. And that's just irresponsible. You don't know what you're putting out into the wild. You don't know what genetic or even disease and pathogens you're actually going to put out in that population. You need to find out if they're there in the first place. Yeah. And if the vegetation's right, then there's a good chance that the animals will be there as well.
So quite possibly some of our local wildlife site owners may well have harvest mice on their land but don't know about it. So obviously they could get involved in the survey.
If you'd like to go, yeah, there's details on our webpage, mammalsociety.org, where you can go to surveys and you'll get information there. But ideally, you want somebody to come out and show you how to find nests, and that's maybe something we can set up for next year.
Right, that'd be great. So we've got a question here: should you report one if you are not sure?
Yes, we would encourage everybody to send in records of any mammals, regardless of what they are. You can do that either through our webpage. We have a recording page there, or you can use what's called Mammal Mapper. And before Andy has a go, obviously you record mammals and you have your own database there. Everything is shared back to local record centres through that.
Yeah, so yeah, we have Subrec here. So if it went to the Mammal Society, it would find its way to Subrec, and presumably if it went to Subrec, hopefully it would find its way to yourselves.
That's right, it works both ways. And again, everything that comes into us, we have independent verifiers through iRecord that just check that record. So if there's any doubt, that recorder, that verifier will then contact you and say, oh, do you think it might be this, or do you think it might be that?
Yeah. So any records you've got, all well worth going in. Best grass type.
I prefer the long grasses of the taller grasses, but basically anything where you can't see through. So if you think that this mouse is only in old money 2 inches long, so if you've got grass stems that are 3 inches apart, it's very hard for them to actually sit on a leaf and reach across to another leaf to actually pull together to make a nest. But anywhere where the vegetation, the grass stems are close together is worthwhile. So if you're on your land, if you've got a hedgerow, just leave a grass strip next to it so that it grows up through. That'll be sufficient for them. If you've got an area that you're letting go and you've got what most people classify as rough grass, then that again will be fine. Some of the single on the set aside land, some of the wild bird seeds, cover mixes is fine. They go into that as well.
I know a lot of our local wildlife owners sort of have species hay meadows, which will be getting cut probably sometime from middle of July through August. How do the harvest mice fare in a sort of traditionally managed hay meadow?
That's something we don't actually know.
Right.
Simply because we only tend to look for those nests late season, so we're not disturbing.
Yeah.
Really up to them when they actually cut. Do they find nests when they cut?
Yeah.
And if they don't, then the harvest mice aren't using it because it is that transient structure that's there. Traditionally, as we said, within the cornfields and everything else, they were always cut in the summer, and the mice were there, and they were known as harvest mice because they're the ones that ran away at that time.
Right, yeah. I think we have one more question. Do short-tailed field voles and harvest mice live in the same areas? They have lots of short-tailed field voles. Yeah, they live side by side.
Yes, they live side by side, and the reason they don't compete for food is that generally the short-tailed field voles stay majority of the time on the ground or near the ground, and majority of the time the harvest mice are actually up in the stalks. So they're actually eating different bits of vegetation. But yes, they do coexist in the same place. And if you've got a good number of short-tailed field voles, then harvest mice should be there. Having said that, even on those cut sections on verges where the vegetation is only as I say, a couple of inches up to sort of 4 or 5 inches tall, then that's going to be good for field voles, but it's not going to be good for harvest mice.
Right. Yeah. There we go. Right. I think that's absolutely perfectly on time so far. So thank you, Derek. That's great. So we've all got a tea break now. So go off, do what you need to do, and see you all back at 20 to 12. Thank you very much again, Derek. There we go. welcome back, everybody. I'm glad to see we haven't lost any participants during the break, which is great. No one's decided to clear off before my talk. Just out of interest, someone, Brian, has put a photo in the chat there of a mammal nest. So I don't know if Eric, if you're still with us, I think you are. I don't know if you'd be able to have a quick look at that and feedback what you think it might be. It's certainly a ball of vegetation. That's great. And I think a further 3 people have also joined Monmouthshire Rewilding as well. So that's 5 people out of the meeting today have joined that, which is great. Anyway, we are running perfectly to time, but now I'm chatting away and we're going to end up behind time. So over to my talk. Hopefully people can see my screen. So this is Starter for 10. This was Larry's idea of a title taken from University Challenge, but basically it went Wildlife Trust. We try and look after all the wildlife of Gwent, but there's obviously thousands of species, and we need to really sort of try and hone our efforts in on certain things. So we basically chose 10 species, which wasn't easy thing to do, and I can report that harvest mice were on our short list, and even that the white-tailed eagles were considered, but we chose our 10 species. So we wanted 10 vulnerable species, and we're going to focus on them now and for the next 10 years with the intention of really sort of turning around their fortunes in Gwent. This is our 10 species. So we have a shrill carder bee, nightjar, water bowl, grayling butterfly, dipper, pine marten, adder, pink waxcap, let's say barn owl before, I don't know, and hedgehog. That's our 10 species, and here they are in all their glory. See them all there. Real nice mix of species, hopefully. Some real cute, endearing ones. And I know some people don't like snakes so much, but the adder's a magnificent beast there. So why these 10? So you may remember we had Sorrel talk to us last year about the Greater Gwent State of Nature report, which was which focused on 100 species, 100 vulnerable species here in Gwent. So we decided that our 10 species needed to come from that 100. So that kind of helped narrow it down a bit. But we wanted to sort of do work for certain species, which if we're helping that species, in reality, we help countless other species. So for instance, we picked the dipper. If we could make things good for the dipper, they rely on healthy rivers. Therefore, lots of other species that live in our rivers do well. Same for the shrill carder bees. We look after them. Then we're looking after all our flowery grasslands, which support so many other invertebrates, birds, mammals, even the harvest mice we mentioned earlier. Grayling butterfly, we're conscious that maybe not all our best wildlife sites in Gwent, maybe Luke, picture perfect, kind of like the flowery meadows. There's lots of the post-industrial colliery sites, which were at one point maybe scars on the landscape, but now they're turning into fantastic habitats. The grayling butterfly thrives there. So if we look after the grayling butterfly, we look after everything else that relies on those habitats. And then we've got, for instance, the hedgehogs, which are in more sort of urban areas. You know, we don't want to forget about not all our wildlife is out in the countryside. Some of it's in our more urban areas, in our gardens. So if we look after the hedgehogs, we can look at lots of other things within our gardens. We also want the 10 species to be ones that would sort of capture people's imagination, and hopefully they're all readily identifiable by people, because we're going to be relying on records coming in from people. So if we know where they are, we can take measures to protect them. So I'm going to now go through our 10 species. We have the shrill carder bee here, which is, I think, the rarest bumblebee species in the UK, certainly the most threatened. Only sort of 5 populations left in the UK, but we're very fortunate the Gwent Levels is a real stronghold for them. So we've got a real responsibility to look after the shrill carder bee, and we feel it's a species we can do stuff to help. So they're particularly like sort of meadows, and they've got sort of clover and vetch plants. Then we've got tufted vetch there, and species from the dead nettle family. They're a species that got a long tongue, so they favour plants where they can really stick their sort of tongue down in it. So we've got this white dead nettle there. So if you sort of have those species, they're nice sort of, again, maybe the harvest mice we talked about earlier, they prefer maybe taller grass. Certainly where the shrill carder bee are putting their nests, they prefer taller, ranker grassland. So it's something to bear in mind when managing your land, that you may want the areas, all species rich with flowers, but you maybe need these edges, these margins, where maybe a harvest mouse could live, but also where the shrill carder bee can put their nests. And they're also a species of bee that emerges quite late. You've probably seen, probably quite cold today, but some of the warmer days we've had, I've certainly seen bumblebees already this year, but the shrill carder bee, they don't really come out until May, and then they go late in the season, so they're still flying into October. So you need sort of flowers that are available sort of late into September and October as well. So there's certain management needed. So they're a sort of threat. As I said, there's only very localized populations. There could be inbreeding. There's sort of fragmented habitats. As I say, like our network of local wildlife sites, 400 plus of them scattered about, that can help sort of join up these populations. And there's problems with climate change, extreme weather, and then there's all these use of pesticides, and there's various pathogens and killing. But hopefully, on saying our local wildlife sites would like to think we're not using many sort of pesticides or herbicides. So they're a real haven where these shrill carder bees and many other, as I say, looking after the shrill carder bee, but by doing that, looking after all the other bumblebee species, butterflies, grasshoppers, everything that feeds on them, all the wildflowers that are needed to support them. So that's a shrill carder bee. And then next, I'm going to see if there's some sound here. This was working earlier. There we go. Hopefully a barn owl is going to make some noise in the background. But we've got the barn owl here. I think everyone's familiar with the barn owl. Again, I said we were looking for species that are kind of sort of iconic species people can identify, and so they're protected on Schedule 1 of the Wildlife Countryside Act, a sort of bird of open habitats, especially sort of rough grazing. So again, they may be, we're looking after the barn owls. We'd want to create habitat where harvest mice again would be thriving. They might feed on them. But also lots of other species. They've got nest sites and buildings, cavities and rock faces, trees, as well as purpose-built nest boxes, which is where the barn owl to be quiet now. Won't shut. Anyway, it's going to go on in the background. But there's sort of various threats to the barn owl. There's lack of suitable habitat. I dare say on your local wildlife sites, there probably is good barn owl habitat, but there's rodenticide poisoning. Obviously, people sort of poisoning rats, that builds up through the food system. You kill the kind of barn owls, and then there's lots of barn conversions going on. Certainly, across maybe particularly in Monmouthshire, there's lots of barn conversions, and these barns, hence their name, that's where they'd be breeding. But if they're converted into houses, they lose their nesting sites. There's road mortalities. I've sadly picked up quite a few barn owls and sent them off sort of post-mortems. Find out, well, I'm going to say why they died. It was obvious why they died. They got hit by cars. But if you send them off, they can report what sort of chemical levels are in their bodies and the like. And also they're susceptible to fluctuations in prey and poor weather as well. If it rains a lot, then the barn owl really can't go out to hunt. So they're up against all sorts of problems. But again, I'll touch more on at the end of the talk, sort of how you as local wildlife site owners can sort of help the barn owl. But we'll run through all the different species. You've got the barn owl there. Then we've got the adder. So it's Britain's only venomous reptile, sort of most often heaths, moors, and coastal areas. I know I've been going around all the local wildlife sites for the last 10 years, and something I'm quite often told by yourselves is how there used to be adders on your land, and now there isn't. So they're dying out, and it's something we can turn around. if you've got a site where you've got adders, and can we take measures to preserve that population so that's not the next one that dies out, or if they used to be there, is there ways of encouraging them back in? And there's various surveys going on at the moment with the amphibian sort of reptile groups, but it has been stated this is potentially a species that could be extinct by 2032, which is a very worrying thought. But thankfully things are being done to protect them. But as they're a venomous reptile, they are sort of mistakenly persecuted. There's habitat mismanagement. Again, very small populations dotted about. Then you can get genetic inbreeding and great risk of sort of localized extinctions, the disturbance, there's climate change, which is a common theme throughout everything, which is in some ways a little bit out of our hands, but obviously we can all do our bit to sort of prevent climate change. And then there's predation by game birds, and maybe what people don't realise that things like pheasants, particularly when lots of reptiles, when they're young, pheasants love eating, young slow worms, young snakes. So if you've got a high density of pheasants in an area, then it can result in the extinction of species such as adder. And then we've got the dipper here, really lovely little bird on our water courses, sort of unique among songbirds, because most of our songbirds are sat up in trees singing away, but the dipper very much sings away, and it is a songbird, but it's the only one that sort of lives in water, and it happily dives underwater. So we can find them on a lot of our water courses. I'm sure, as you know, it's very much publicised at the moment, particularly the River Wye is in a very poor state with pollution. The River Usk is probably just as bad, and lots of our other water courses. That's a real problem with dipper. And then there's sort of predation by feral mink and just loss of nest sites. They've got off nest under bridges. These things are lost, but sort of illustration here. If we can do work to reduce pollution in rivers, to make things better for the dipper, then there'll be more otters, there'll be more little mayfly larvae there, which the dipper feed on. If there's more of them, then there's more salmon. You've basically got healthy rivers. So this is kind of the idea of looking after these 10 species. We look after thousands of species and all our sort of key habitats. And then we've got here the pink ballerina waxcap, sort of an iconic species, but really we picked the pink ballerina waxcap, but it's really representing all the other grassland fungi. You can see all this down in the bottom right there, this huge sort of diversity in colour of different grassland fungi. And South Wales is probably about the most important place in the world for grassland fungi. So we've got a real responsibility to look after them. Again, if we look after the habitats for these grassland fungi, then also generally where they are, it's also species rich, flowery grassland as well. And it's all the insects, all the birds, all the mammals. So we look after this, we look after everything else. But again, there sort of can be habitat mismanagement. There can be too much cutting, not enough cutting. If you just left your grassland not cut, then quite quickly the grassland fungi would die out. They do rely on it being mowed and grazing. Again, if you put fertilizer, lime on there, and a real issue, which was sort of touched on a bit with Cherry's talk with the rewilding, there's actually a real push for tree planting. And it'd be very easy to plant a load of trees on a grassland, and it may well be that there's a load of grassland fungi there, and possibly it might not even be realised that it was a really sort of important site for grassland fungi. So they only appear for maybe 2 or 3 weeks a year. So if you went out and looked at the site the wrong time of year, you might think, oh, we'll stick a load of trees in here, and then if you stick the trees in, eventually you're going to lose all your grassland fungi. So it's quite loud, he is. But that's the lovely sound of a night jar there. Just do a quick plug for one of our walks later on this year. We'll be doing a walk. I wonder if I can make that stop now. It doesn't want to stop. It'll stop eventually. We're going to walk up on Beacon Hill in June. If you want to come and join us on that evening to hear the nightjars up on Beacon Hill, then you can book that on our website. But again, sort of an iconic bird, loads of folklore with them. But again, a bird that has sort of struggled. They rely on lots of airborne insects. And I don't know if anyone was involved in our Bugs Matter sort of citizen science work, but it showed us that was recording numbers of insects that got splattered on our car number plates over the last 2 years. And just the number of flying insects has been found from that is just hugely dropped. So if there's less flying insects, there's less species such as nightjar to eat. But again, there's been sort of large-scale lost peatlands, agricultural, construction, afforestation. Quite a big issue with sort of ground nesting species such as nightjar is like dogs off leads, disturbing them. And there's also, as these are migratory species, we can do all we want to sort of protect them here in Gwent. We spend a lot of their winter up on migration or down in Africa, and it's issues happening there. But we're going to try and do as much as we can to make sure things are as good as possible here in Gwent to give them their best chance. And we've got the water vole, which I think it's been very much publicised just how much water vole populations dropped, a 94% decline since the mid-1980s, which is, you know, incredibly bad, really. A lot of that was due to predation by sort of American mink, but also habitat loss, drainage of land, all sorts of issues. But it must be about 10 years now. After much, we were discussing reintroduction of the harvest mice. We did lots of research previous to it, and we did reintroduce water voles onto the Gwent levels, where they are now thriving. But there's further work we're perhaps thinking of doing, because we've got a good population between, well, east of the River Usk, where we did our reintroduction, but the water voles can't really cross the River Usk. So we'll be doing another reintroduction to the west of the River Usk, sort of over Wentloog. So this is kind of the work we're looking at doing in the future. And then we've got pine marten, which is maybe a bit different to the other species, because a species we don't, well, until very recently didn't have here in Gwent. But again, it's been another reintroduction. But Gloucestershire Wildlife Trust reintroduced pine marten to the Forest of Dean just a few years ago, and there was a reintroduction up in Midwest Wales. And the hope is that the ones in Midwest Wales are going to be gradually moving south and east, and the ones in Gloucestershire, some of them have already made it over the River Wye into Gwent. These two populations are going to join up at some point, and that could well be in Gwent. So, you know, we are very much looking to make sure when they do arrive with us, there's suitable habitat here for them to thrive. And so there's issues with, you know, the current sort of low population levels, and historically they were very heavily persecuted, sorry. But if there's an opportunity here, obviously local wildlife owners, they may turn up on your land, but we are at the moment, we have volunteers sort of out doing sort of surveys throughout the year, looking for signs and sort of scat surveys or whatever, and potentially people can put up sort of camera traps on their land to see if pine martens are there. And then potentially if pine marten do appear on your land, there's possibilities of having proper denning nest boxes installed, kind of thing. So obviously on your local wildlife sites, if you keep an eye out for the pine martens, and obviously if there's any signs, that we would love to hear, and then there's, you know, potentially more we can do to help encourage them on your land. And then onto the grayling butterfly, a species that's dropped a lot in numbers, and they particularly sort of like coastal areas, but here in Gwent, particularly on sort of brownfield sites and sort of former colliery spoil sites, they're doing well. So again, as I was saying, if we can do measures to protect the grayling butterfly, then we'll protect all sorts of the species that live on those habitats. And I think this is the 10th species. Everyone loves a hedgehog, but they've obviously a very familiar species, but they've declined in some parts of the UK by up to 75% in rural areas in the last 40 years. So as I was saying earlier, they're probably doing better and more closely associated with more urban urban areas, parks, gardens. So this is sort of links in well with, you know, people doing wildlife friendly gardening, that kind of thing. But, you know, they're struggling. There's all sorts of pesticides. We have to encourage people not to be using molluscicides, things to kill slugs in the garden, because they, you know, that they get into the slugs, kill the slugs, the hedgehogs eat them, poison builds up in them, and they die, and there's lots get killed in our roads. So there are species that's up against it, but I think it's one that can definitely, lots of people can take measures to sort of protect. So what are we doing? We're sort of mapping existing and historical sites for each species. Then we're going to try to ascertain whether they're still present. We're establishing partnerships with lots of relevant organisations for each species. We're creating action plans for each species, so we sort of have an idea of what we're going to do and what we hope the results will be from that. We're influencing and supporting management to preserve and enhance population on existing sites. Some of these species could well be on your local wildlife sites. We're looking at where populations disappeared. Can they be restored? Can new sites be created for the species, particularly focused on sort of enhancing connectivity between sites? If there's a population here and a population there, can we do something with some of the intervening habitat so that they can naturally recolonize that, and then the two sort of separate populations can then mingle and there's less inbreeding? And we're going to be promoting each species and its plight through media and education, which I'm doing in a small way here today, but there'll be lots of sort of promotion of these species. Then we're going to be looking to secure funding for projects either for all 10 species or for individual species. And then we'll be monitoring the success or possibly failures of our actions to make sure whatever we do is meaningful and having a proper effect. So this is one of the action plans we've prepared. I don't expect you to read that. That's for the shrill card to be. There'll be an action plan for all 10 of our species. And then sort of what maybe you can do. So as local wildlife owners, you're already very much doing your bit, sort of systematically managing your lands, creating these vital havens, all this connectivity across Gwent. But could you encourage further wildlife? You know, could there be a barn owl box, leaving some areas of ranker grassland for bees' nests, gardening more friendly for hedgehogs? And I know that some of you may, well, you've got your local wildlife site, but you have additional land. You know, would you be interested in that additional land, which isn't local wildlife site quality, enhancing that, taking some measures on that to encourage some of these other species? And obviously, you can always speak to your friends, speak to your neighbours, let them know what's happening on your land, encouraging people to sort of be a bit more friendly to wildlife on their land. And again, as we touched on in the harvest mouse talk, sort of, it's very important to report all your sightings, whether it's on your land or when you're out and about, because if we know where these species are, then we can take measures in the appropriate locations to protect them. So if you have any records of these 10 species and any of the other countless thousands, all records are important, but particularly these 10 species for the purposes of this, you can send them into that South East Wales Biodiversity Record Centre, SUPEC. So there's a link there, and Larry may be able to drop a link into the chat. If you could please, Larry, that would be great. I'm sure a lot of you send in your records anyway, but if you can do it, all just helps just to build up this picture, and we can inform our sort of work better. And I always finish any talk I do with, I'm sure most of you are Gwent Wildlife Trust members, but if you're not, if you would care to join, that would be fantastic. So obviously helps us do all our education work, all our campaigning work, all our work to protect all of Gwent's wildlife. So there we go. I don't know whether I'm keeping to time or not. I'm sure Larry can tell me, am I keeping to time?
Well, it's 12:05, so you finished with 10 minutes for questions.
Oh, blimey, 10 minutes.
And it looks like we have got a couple coming in now.
Right.
So.
Oh, I can see these.
Shall I ask you them just so it's
let's do it all nice and nice for the banter.
Okay, so our first question from Andy is, can barn owls exist alongside tawny owls?
Oh, blimey. I would say there will be competition between the two, I'm sure. And I think quite a bit there'll be competition for resources, but barn owl is definitely more of a species of more open grassland than not a woodland species, where the tawny owl is more of a woodland species. So they're definitely occupying different sort of niches there. I think there could certainly be competition for nest sites, which with a lot of our goes for a lot of our wildlife. Actual proper, safe, secure nest sites are a real limiting factor, particularly as both of them could utilize old trees, and there's kind of like this health and safety comes into it. People take down old trees because they might be a bit dangerous, but you need these old trees. And this is where, you know, people do provide nest boxes. And I know there is a scheme at the moment providing barn owl boxes. We've got some installed on our reserves, and we've had barn owls move in, and we've had baby barn owls.
Yeah, they've really worked, those boxes.
Yeah, and I know they've been installed in some of our local wildlife sites as well. So if you're interested in the barn owl box, then I probably won't give out their details, because but if they contact us, then we can put you in contact with the person who's sticking out the barn owl boxes. So I've gone a little bit off topic there, so there will be some competition. I think if you've got a really healthy, well looked after land, there's generally space for all wildlife.
And then Cherry's asked, how far back would it be appropriate to record a sighting?
Go back as far as you want. Subrek only had last month, it was like an amnesty, like people handing in firearms and the like. This was for people who hadn't handed in their records going back years, and they had sort of said, please just hand in any records. So they, even if it was, you know, on a scrap of paper from 20 years ago, because the historical records are really sort of interesting. You know, it could be that this thing was there then, but it isn't now. So basically the short answer is they can go back as far as you want. So for a record, all you need is who recorded it, where, when, the species, and preferably how many of them. I think that makes the record. So,
yeah, it's the 5 Ws or something like that, isn't
yeah.
it? Yeah, so I think
any record's good, and even the most commonest species, and I'm as guilty as any as not sending in. I'd probably send in more of the rarer stuff, but even the common stuff's vital, because I'm trying to think of a species that was, say water vole 30 years ago. You might see them everywhere, and you think, not bothering sending in those records. Increased by 94% kind of thing. So it's good to have this documentation. So even the today's common species might be tomorrow's rare species. It's all important.
yeah, definitely. And I would say Subrek have got an app, so it does make it quite a lot easier to submit your records. It's based on the same as the iRecord app. So if you've used that one in the past, it's exactly the same format. But it's really great. It's just, you know, a few clicks. You can even do it whilst you're out and about walking around.
Yeah.
And there's a map you can draw up, and it allows you to kind of pinpoint where you are. So you can be quite specific about where your record is without knowing off the top of your head the grid reference. And you can add photos as well. So if you're worried that you haven't quite got your identifications correct, someone will come along and verify it. There's verifiers for all the sort of species groups who go through and check them at intervals. So yeah, it's a great way to do it. And I'm as guilty as anyone. I've got probably thousands of photos on my mobile phone that I've just clicked in the moment, and I should really go back through and turn those into useful records. So yeah.
Maybe if people do have records, they can put aside one day, and that'll be their day for clear.
Yeah.
But as Larry says, if you can do it on your phone as you go along, because I'm bad, if I get home, I think, oh, I'm going to do that now, and it gets put off, and before you know it, it's kind of lost. If you do it in the moment, then it's done, and then it's all vital stuff. So, and got so I'm taking your job here, Larry. Sorry.
It's fine. I think someone was just saying they've seen a barn owl from putting a box up themselves. So
excellent. So yeah, they really are effective. I think sort of putting up any of these things, you know, bird boxes, bat boxes, all good. But I think from what I can gather, barn owl boxes, and the chap who comes round to do it, he will. I don't think he'll put it up if he doesn't think there's a chance. So he'll think, right, this looks as broken, and he'll know exactly the best tree and the best aspect and the best chance of success kind of thing. So quite a lot of the local wildlife sites could potentially have barn owls on them. So
yeah, definitely. I've got a bit of a fun question. I was just wondering, which of these sort of 10 species are you most excited to get to work on?
I think the shrill carder bee could be good, because I think I think there's a lot can be done on the Gwent levels for them. Obviously, we picked all species. We didn't want to pick what it said, but there was maybe some species you kind of think they really are. We wanted to pick species that we thought there was a chance to maybe turn their fortunes around, kind of. If we wanted to be able to be successful, so I think the shrill Carder bee could be a really good one. I think we've got tickets responsibility for the shrill Carder bee as well, so that's one we really want to. I mean, we've got them on our reserves as well, which is good. So they are down in the Gwent levels, but we had one record sort of up Ever Vale kind of thing. So
yeah,
you never quite know. So
there's always been some slight questions about that one, whether we accidentally transported it in one of our vehicles just because it was so far outside the range.
yeah,
but it could just be another sign that we're not looking in certain places because we assume they're very much limited to where we've always known they are.
So if you don't go out and look, but I'm sure if people go out on the land and have a real good look, there'll be surprises turn up, I think.
Yeah, and I think one of the things we hope to do is try and link people up with training resources as well, and hopefully we'll be able to put on some training ourselves, because I know that's a big barrier, is people not having the confidence in knowing how to identify these species. So hopefully we can get a few more recorders added to the pool. I think we've got
our shrill Carder bee training last summer, and I felt confident shrill Carder bee, having been out with Bumblebee Conservation Trust. So if we can lay on more sort of activities, and it's with the local wildlife site network, it's very easy for us to share all these opportunities. So we shall do. And then,
we've got another question from Cherry. Which is the most threatened? That's a test for you there, Andy.
Blimey. Remember what they all are now. Again, it could be the shrill Carder bee out of them. It's quite possibly the most threatened, with only 5 populations in the UK.
Yeah.
The thing that does worry them all is obviously we can take all these more local measures, but then there's the overarching thing of climate change. And if we happen to get lots of cold, wet summers, then particularly things such as bees can really sort of struggle. So that probably is the most threatened out of all of them. And I think the water vole potentially could be, if I think the thing without really focused conservation measures, the water vole could disappear, I think. But there are good focused things going on there. And as I did say, that the amphibian reptile group predicted that adder could go extinct by 2030, which makes that's extinct in the UK. I think that makes it pretty threatened, to be honest.
Yeah, I think some of these species for us, they're a bit daunting, because they will present quite a challenge in terms of there's a reason why they're not doing well, and that's because they are quite tricky species to provide for, especially when their habitats are so depleted.
It's kind of knowing why. Water vole, I think we very much knew mink was the main problem. So if you can sort of exclude mink from areas and put the water vole back in, they should in theory thrive. But the adder population is very sort of spread out, and
we've certainly set ourselves a fair bit of work there, I think.
There we go. But as I say, hopefully we help those 10 species and we drag another 10,000 species along with it, kind of thing.
Yeah, that's the plan. So fingers crossed.
Indeed.
We're about a minute to go, but if Sophie is ready, I will disappear.
Righto, thank you, Larry. Righto, and then last but not least, we have Dr. Sophie Lee Williams, founder of Eagle Reintroduction Wales, and currently working for the Durrell Wildlife Conservation Trust. So I'm not going to say anything more. I'm just going to let Sophie Lee crack on with it. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Andy. It's a delight to be the last talk of the day. I've really enjoyed the event, so thank you very much for holding it. And as Andy said, my name is Dr. Sophie Lee Williams, and I am a raptor biologist. I've been working with raptors now for over 16 years, and I've been working with eagles for about 8. I am the founder of Eagle Reintroduction Wales, and I'm currently working for Durrell to now obviously restore the species to Wales. So I had a very long 6 or 7 years journey gathering the research. So today, hopefully we'll give you a bit of an insight how we've got the ball rolling with white-tailed eagle reintroductions in Wales. And Eagle Reintroduction Wales now has an extensive partnership, which I'll go into throughout the talk. So our main aim, if you haven't figured it out already, is to restore a breeding population of white-tailed eagles in Wales. And we're at the moment doing this in partnership with Gwent Wildlife Trust and the Wildfowl and Wetland Trust. And we're looking at the feasibility of restoring this species in Southeast Wales and the Severn Estuary. So hopefully today we'll give you an insight about, if we restore white-tailed eagles, how do we go about a reintroduction? Why are we proposing one? What do we need to consider, and where will a reintroduction happen? But before we get into the nitty-gritty, excuse me, I've got a sore throat today, but before we get into the nitty-gritty of the ERW project, I wanted to introduce you to our white-tailed sea eagle, or commonly known really across the European range as sea eagles, which translates in the Welsh language as Arara Môr. And these species are part of the Acridae family, which contains eagles, hawks, and buzzards. And an eagle in lay terms is just a common name for large birds of prey, which are active during the day. And our sea eagle, white-tailed eagle, actually is part of the fish eagle family, or the Haliaeetus group, and they are closely related to the likes of American bald eagles, African fish eagles, and Steller sea eagles. And all of these species are aquatic prey specialists. So they're tied into water bodies. White-tailed eagle is our largest bird of prey in the UK. And they weigh the same size of a sack of spuds, for example, and they have the same wingspan as the width of a bus. But the reason why they have these large wingspans is they're energy consumers. So they carry less weight per area of wing, which basically helps them thrive in lowland habitats. So you'll see these species really, like I said, across our marine and freshwater systems. So you'll see them in our coastlines, estuaries and wetlands, and also inland lakes and river systems. So water bodies really are really important for this species, and they normally breed or, within really 3 kilometers of a water body. Now, these species are also known as littoral zone hunters, and before I didn't even know what that meant, but they are basically species that hunt in shallow water. So our osprey, for example, in Wales, are able to plunge dive, couldn't say that then. And our white-tailed eagle is a very large-bodied bird, so they're not able to submerge themselves in the water. So they have a very different niche to our ospreys, where they hunt shallow water fish. They nest in large mature trees or coastal crags. Most of our European white-tailed eagles breed in large mature trees, but they can often switch in their territories between coastal if available. And they prey for a large species actually tied into aquatic. They've got a very generalized diet. They are extreme generalists, and their preferred prey through the spring and summer when readily available is fish. So across Europe, 40 to 60% of their diet is fish species. They're also a specialist of aquatic water birds. So for example, ducks, geese, but they're also able to take the likes of gulls, cormorants, herons, a large variety of birds, even the likes of wood pigeon, for example, which are very slow on the wing and a very easy catch for a white-tailed eagle. Unlike other eagles, these species are all year-round scavengers. So carrion constitutes a big proportion of their diet compared to other eagle species, and also to a secondary capacity, mammals as well. So rats, for example, are a huge part of white-tailed eagle diet, and rabbits in their first 2 years are really important as well, and there's plenty of rabbits, as we know, in lowland areas of Wales, in particular in Southeast Wales. So these, like I said, these species are extreme generalists. So now we know about the species. How do we go about a reintroduction? Now, it's not as easy as most people make out. We can't just click our fingers and release these birds free willy-nilly into the Welsh landscape. These reintroduction programs are really strictly highly regulated license applications, and I've spent the last 6 years of my life. They're normally around 10 years from obviously theory to actual successful reintroductions. But the main authority figure that allows us to, or kind of gives us our license is Natural Resources Wales. And these are really comprehensive assessments which are split into the feasibility of restoring the species. So, you know, the biological feasibility, environmental feasibility, ecological and socioeconomic. So very comprehensive assessments. Now, over the last 6 years, we've completed about 60–70% of these assessments, and we've got our regional assessments left to gather. But license applications are different for every species. So how do we know how to address or put our license application together? And that is simply, you know, we've shaped all of our research over the last 6 years and continue moving forward around European reintroduction guidelines, so the IUCN criteria, and also local NRW requirements as well, at a national scale across Wales. So why are we proposing a reintroduction? So if we restore white-tailed eagles, is it the most acceptable option for the species? And this is where most of our time has been spent. We do feel like it's an acceptable option for the species. The species in itself has a particular biology which allows them not to thrive very well. So, for example, they have extreme natal philopatry, which means that they have extreme commitments to their birthplaces. So when they fledge out of their nest sites, they have 5 years as youngsters to explore before they come back to breed. When they reach maturity and are ready to breed at the age of 4 or 5 years of age, they then go back to their nest site or near their nest sites to breed. This allows populations to expand really, really slowly. And I'll give you an example of this. So all of our breeding white-tailed eagles at the moment are in West and North, I was going to say Wales then, I wish, North Scotland. So these birds were restored back in the 1970s, and a 50-year rolling scheme of reintroductions have helped the birds become restored today. And there's now 150 breeding pairs, which is the strongest breeding population in the UK. In Ireland, they followed suit of restoring these birds in 2003. Now there's between 12 and 15 pairs since their release. There's now 2 pairs up in East Scotland. This was deemed as an unsuccessful reintroduction where they released youngsters, but they just add, because the population on the west side is so big, they just drew those species add into the breeding population on the west side. And more recently, if you do follow white-tailed eagle reintroductions, on the Isle of Wight, a very small scale restoration project happened in 2019, where they're still in the process of releasing birds and will be in the process of releasing birds for the next 2 years. But now, excitingly, there's 1 pair of white-tailed eagles since the 2019 reintroduction. So what we found with ERW is much of southern Britain is still void of eagles, and particularly in Wales, natural colonisation of white-tailed eagles is not going to occur on their own accord in the next 50 to 80 years. So we feel like to restore this species in Wales, restoring them through a reintroduction project is the best option, or the most acceptable option. We know from our research that, well, white-tailed eagles were widely distributed in historic Britain. So we've delved into the science with Richard Evans and Derek Yaldins. And as you can see, there's massive knowledge gaps gaps for the records of Wales. So historically speaking, research shows that there was at least 1,000 to 1,400 breeding pairs of white-tailed eagles historically across Britain. But we had a big challenge because in Wales we had a knowledge gap. So this is where ERW started. We started delving through Welsh literature and we found records, I think it was 79 records for white-tailed eagles across Wales. And we have historic records for every county now across Wales. So definitely filled in this knowledge gap, and we had no doubt that they were widespread, alongside the UK and European distribution. But this now provides evidence that this bird was widespread in Wales. They were tied into our heritage and culture through Welsh place names as well as archaeological records. So we can say that it's, that we're aiming for a mitigation reintroduction to restore this species back to the historic ranges, which is fantastic. Our source population, for example, so we are binded by our IUCN criteria, so we can't get our source populations from Scotland because the population is too small. So there's a problem with future imminent declines of that population if we take 50 eagles out of that environment. But for example, we do have massive strongholds in Russia and Norway. Obviously, we don't want to link with Russia at the moment. So Norway is where we would get our wild birds from. And Norway have been involved in UK reintroduction since the 1970s. So we're working with experts with over 50 years of experience. And of course, it's not a novel concept. So reintroductions have been happening in the UK since the 1970s. Here's Roy Dennis here, reintroducing white-tailed eagles to the Isle of Rum in the 1970s. And here's Roy's Isle of Wight reintroduction in 2021. Also, an ecologically similar species, bald eagle, this has been happening in America since the 1980s. And we've got a wealth of experience really restoring Haliaeetus and sea eagles. So not only will it influence the species, but it will have a Welsh national and international importance for the conservation of this species. So in Wales, we are not only restoring a native lost species and their ecosystem functions to form a Welsh freshwater and marine habitats, but because of our geographic location, it will have a UK importance. So South East Wales is bordering Wales and England. So it would, restoring white-tailed eagles to South East Wales would allow the species not only to disperse into Wales, but also disperse into southern West Britain or southern Britain. So strengthening the population numbers and increasing metapopulation dynamics as well of those other populations around the UK. And also this project would have a European importance by securing the long-term European population just by restoring them back to the historic ranges. But by restoring white-tailed eagles, we also have an opportunity to restore health and resilience to aquatic and terrestrial habitats. So this species has a wide array of habitats and prey. So by restoring their ecosystem functions, they are tied into wider conservation benefits. So the main ecosystem function of an eagle or white-tailed eagle is to keep seasonal prey numbers in check. So one of the staple diets, and one example of this, when you take an apex predator like a white-tailed eagle out of the landscape, their prey exponentially grows. So for example, coot and mallard are one of the staple diets of white-tailed eagles across Europe, and we definitely have seen increases in the Welsh landscape of our coot and mallard. Any water body you go to, these are the species that you would have on your tick list. So species like grey mullet as well are definitely in numerous populations around shallow waters and estuaries across Wales. particularly the Severn Estuary. So these are examples of prey numbers which are available in the landscape, but are also experiencing population increases by not having species like this around. They also have a function which has an effect on middle predators. And just to give you an example of a mesopredator or middle predator, gull species, herons, cormorants are all examples of this, buzzards, red kites. So when you take an apex predator like a white-tailed eagle out the environment, these populations grow. They act as our apex predators and have a top-down effect. So they have significant impacts on lower food chains. So by restoring white-tailed eagles and white-tailed eagles having an influence on our cormorant numbers, our heron numbers, and our gulls like greater blackback, actually allows them populations to reduce, and also lower populations and their prey species increase from bottom up. So really having a significant impact on all of the food chain from prey to middle trophic predators. They are also natural, well, they're all year round scavengers, so they're natural cleanup services. So this is tied into healthier landscapes as well. So definitely can provide natural cleanup services within terrestrial habitats, and also there are natural shoreline scavengers, and there's plenty of dead things around Wales, we can say that. They're also something that, well, they provide trophic process linkers. So they provide the transfer of nutrients between habitats. And I'll give you an example of this. So white-tailed eagles in Southeast Wales would breed in our woodland habitats or large mature trees. And there's only one species, so for example, the osprey that I know in Wales that does this, that transfers nutrients from aquatic water bodies into woodlands. So this species can provide nutrient cycling to natural habitats, something that's been missing for over 150 years. They also transfer significant amount of energy through the food chain, so allowing other species to thrive. And I've already said about resource linkers, I've done 2 in 1. So yeah, so they have a wide variety of ecosystem services and functions that can help us, especially now with these new subsidy payments for sustainable land management. White-tailed eagles really could help us think about how we can manage our landscapes in a sustainable way. So like I said, they bring, there's an opportunity to bring wider conservation economic benefits. So they are bioindicator species, so like American bald eagles, we can help, this species would help management of habitat condition, disease, pollution, and climate change. They're iconic and charismatic species, so we can use this species to help promote some of the problems or further promote some of the problems in our special places across Southeast Wales. And they're also an umbrella species. So in time, extra areas that are used by white-tailed eagles could be additional SPAs, which allows sanctuaries for other biodiversity, but that's a very long-term picture. And also they bring economic benefits. So a very well-known study on the Isle of Mull and Isle of Skye for white-tailed eagles have found that they have a massive economic benefit. So just by white-tailed eagles alone, in the tourism kind of the Isle of Mull, they bring in about 4.9 to 8 million pounds of tourist spend, with 2.1 million of that going to local income supported, so local businesses. So that's actually a huge contribution just for one species, and also supports 110 jobs. So they do have a lot of benefits. So what do we need to consider? So what resources are here for white-tailed eagles? So what I've done is I've done research on habitat suitability all across the UK, which is now being used to inform white-tailed eagle conservation on the ground. So this research for habitat suitability for white-tailed eagles across the UK has allowed us to use this now to inform our work in Wales. So what we've found is that the Severn Estuary in particular holds a significant amount of white-tailed eagle habitat. And obviously the Severn Estuary is part of the wider Bristol Channel. So we know that the Bristol Channel, as they disperse over time, and we're talking about 50-year time frame here, there is plenty of suitable habitat for this species. When we've had a look at nesting resources as well, so this is the distribution of large mature woodlands around water bodies. And as you can see, there's plenty of ancient woodland cover around Southeast Wales for this species. And also as they disperse out across the Bristol Channel, a lot of large mature trees that are fringing our coastlines on both Welsh and English side. We've also had a look at coastal crags. So as you can see here, there's a difference in distribution between trees and crags, but there are plenty of nest sites for white-tailed eagles to choose from. Another part of our research is to look at how much historic habitat has been lost. It's been over 150 years since white-tailed eagles have been here. So we've also had a look at how the habitat that has been lost to anthropogenic land uses like urban areas. We don't expect to see white-tailed eagles in the middle of Cardiff and Bath, for example. So we've calculated how much displacement or breeding displacement occurs across this landscape. And we found that even with breeding displacement and modern day land uses, this particular area can support up to 50 breeding eagles. So absolutely fantastic, even with modern day land uses. So we know that we're aiming for a very small reintroduction. So the release of 50 birds over a 10-year time frame will allow us to create 6 to 10 breeding eagles. So we know that Southeast Wales and the wider Bristol Channel are able to support this long-term or short-term goal. So our feasibility study suggests that it is very suitable. And we've also had a look at diet as well. So these ongoing assessments as part of our regional assessments. But for example, white-tailed eagles have we found over 1,000 prey items for white-tailed eagles. So they're very generalist species. Their dietary needs for a large bird actually don't require much food in a day, between 500 to 600 grams. So to put that into perspective, I've tried to find relatable things. So a hamster, for example, weighs between 250 to 300 grams. So 2 to 3 hamsters a day for a white-tailed eagle is more than fine for it to survive. So for a big species, they don't have large dietary needs. And their prey normally is between 1 to 5 kilograms. So we found that they can't really lift anything over half of their body weight. But generally speaking, 0.5 to 1.5 kilograms on average is the prey size for a white-tailed sea eagle. So one of our main questions is there enough prey available for sea eagles? This is just a bit of research that we've done at a national scale, just to show you what our research looks like. We've had a look at the relative abundance of all types of prey across Wales. This includes birds and mammals, and we're also looking at fish and carrion as well. But I'm sorry, this here shows the relative abundance of mammals and birds across Southeast Wales. So I'll zoom in for this, I can't even speak now with my throat. So I'll zoom into this view. So what we've found is, just as an indicator, we are doing detailed species-specific analysis, but just as an indicator, and this is the density of ducks, geese, swans per 10 kilometres across Southeast Wales. So this is not just 879 geese across Southeast Wales, this is per 10 kilometres squared. So there is a lot of ducks, geese and swans, cormorants and shags, coots, rails and craigs, herons and bitterns, gulls, crows, ravens and magpies, and grebes. Perfect assemblage of prey species for white-tailed eagles. We also know that there's lesser density of mammals, but definitely in regards to upland and lowland habitat, rabbits and hares are a lot denser in lowland habitats of Wales. We know there's a lot of foxes, rats around for these species, and also weasels and badgers as well. So a good composition of prey. As part of our ongoing assessments, we are also looking at something called habitat regulations assessment. So here we're looking at the risk to our special protected habitats and the risk to our protected species in these regions. And particularly for Southeast Wales, this area is designated an area of importance for migratory fish, wintering waterfowl and wager assemblages. So we don't feel like white-tailed eagles would come in and decimate all our wildlife. But for example, we are gathering comprehensive research around the risk to some of these protected species. So for example, research on Berwick swan, shelduck, greater white-fronted geese, Godwall, Dunlin and redshank. We're also looking at stuff like curlew as well. So we're very much, conducting comprehensive assessments around the feasibility. So where will a reintroduction happen? And this now comes to the end of our talk, but we've been conducting release site surveys with Gwent Wildlife Trust across Southeast Wales for the last year. The aim of this work, and it's been funded by the Rural Development Programme of Monmouthshire Council, and the aim of this work is really to find an optimum release site for white-tailed eagles in Southeast Wales. We've worked with over 25 landowners for these surveys. Here are some of them. We've also worked with private landowners as well. And we've surveyed over 65 sites. So this is what it looks like. Viable sites are parts, non-viable sites are in yellow. And we are now in the process of final selection. So we're still looking at the feasibility of using one of these sites for the release of young birds. But we're still very much in the early phases of this programme, and there's definitely a lot of work to be done. But we've really enjoyed working with landowners in Southeast Wales. So it's been absolutely fantastic. But our plans moving forward really is when we've finally selected our release site, this will anchor us down for the next phases of our research, which will be ecological and socioeconomic. So we will assess regional prey availability at species level. We'll conduct regional HRAs to risk of species. And also after confirmation of a release site, we will then launch our regional public engagement and consultation phases around the restoration of white-tailed eagles. And also we'll be doing this on a national scale across Wales as well. So looking at the attitudes around Wales towards this species being brought back. So, and that's me. So thank you very much for listening. Diolch yn fawr am wrando.
Thank you, Sophie Lee. That was great. It's exciting stuff.
It is.
The big enormous barn doors floating across Gwent.
It'd be brilliant, wouldn't it?
Now then, Larry, do we have any questions at all? Oh, we do. What objections are there to the reintroduction and by whom, please?
It's a good question. So at the moment, we have no objections. We are looking at speaking to our key interest groups. So for example, farmers, and we've started to speak to farmers on the ground. We've worked with some farmers for our release site selection surveys, where we've done our first tier engagement with all of our conservation initiatives on the ground, and it doesn't seem to be any opposition from the conservation. White-tailed eagles are fit into conservation across the Severn Estuary and Monmouthshire. But we are very much now increasing our efforts to speak to key interest groups like fishermen, gamekeepers and farmers on the ground in Southeast Wales. But over the last 6 years, we've done light engagement for eagle reintroduction Wales, and across a national level, there's 3 main concerns: risks to livestock, risk to local biodiversity and risks to children and dogs. So those are our main concerns that we are working with communities and stakeholders about.
Thank you. And then we got a couple of compliments. Wow,
Oh.
work, and thank you, Sophie Lee. Great work. But I'm afraid there's another question for you to answer as well as the compliments. The main cause of pairs not surviving, is there much human predation, egg collection, etc.?
Good question. So historically speaking, yes, there was. White-tailed eagles are a very rare species. Egg collection for many birds of prey was something that helped their extinction locally. But the reason why, for example, the pairs, I mentioned the species have got extreme commitments to their birthplaces. So we do have white-tailed eagles that come into Wales, but they're not of sexual maturity. So, for example, there's nothing to anchor them here. So we get white-tailed eagles in Wales, but there's no adults that will actually settle here because their instinct is to just go back to their birthplaces and breed in close proximity to other eagles. So what we found is from other release schemes that if we release young birds, they imprint on those environments. And while they're in their first in the first 3 years, they have wide distributions and flight. And then if we release young birds in Wales, they would come back and it basically acts as an artificial nest site. So they would then come back to breed. So we find that reintroductions are really important, especially with birds of prey that exhibit natal philopatry.
Now then, more questions. I thought there'd be quite a few questions for you. Great talk. Assuming things go well with further stakeholder engagement, how soon could a reintroduction take place here? And how do you monitor the success of these?
That's a good question. So so we're in the very early phases. So we're at the moment, like I said, putting all of our kind of research on paper. We're speaking to all of the relevant people, Natural Resources Wales. You know, we're now, like I said, putting a community and public stakeholder plan together to reach out to obviously key interest groups. I forgot where I was going with this now. Andy, can you repeat the question, please?
Assuming things go well with further stakeholder engagement, how soon could a reintroduction take place, and how do you monitor the success of reintroduction?
Right. So with it's very flexible. So we're in the early phases. We're hoping to submit a license next year. So most of our engagement would happen on the ground this year. And very much we're hoping for a 2025 release. But that is very, very dependent on how things unfold on the ground and also how our license fends with NRW. It's a very tricky licensing process, like I said. So we would love for these birds to be released by 2025. That's our aim. And with monitoring, we are very much, I'm now employed by Daryl, so we monitor all of our progress through the standards conservation planning. But one of the biggest post-monitoring tools that we'll be using for the release of white-tailed eagles is all of our birds will have satellite tags or trackers on them. So we are able to understand what they're using, what conflicts are coming in, and very much have really comprehensive post-release management of our white-tailed eagles.
So it'd be quite exciting with these satellite tags, just seeing them all going, and
yeah, so it would be quite exciting.
And then seeing them coming back to Gwent in that like 3-5 years, and yeah, so publicity with that as well, just sort of where
to see where they would go. Yeah, so it's very exciting, and obviously it's a no-brainer with the satellite tags. You know, we need to learn with these species alongside them. So satellite tags have been used now for the Isle of Wight, and they've, for example, been really informative, also reduced conflicts on the ground, and really, you know, thorough work with working with landowners, you know, on their land to understand why these species are roosting in those areas, what they're doing, what they're eating. So yeah, it's fantastic tools to work with landowners with these types of projects.
I think that is all the questions. Unless anybody else got anything else? Oh, there we go. Got let off quite lightly there.
I have, yeah.
Oh, no, I spoke too soon. Of course I did. Now, I was thinking about asking about this. Has the bird flu outbreak altered your plans?
Very good question. So, for example, we are bounded by legislation. So we know for all the white-tailed eagle releases last year were put on hold. White-tailed eagles are a species which are tied into a high risk for avian flu because of their waterfowl diets. So if avian flu was to persist as rapid and, you know, it's everywhere at the moment, if that's still the case in 2025, and obviously avian flu has massive fluctuations annually, but if it was still persistent this year and in 2025, then it would definitely put a stop to our plans to reintroduce the birds. I know, for example, the Isle of Wight was last year halted by avian flu. Natural England quite rightly didn't want to give a license, you know, to increase the risk to these birds. So that it's safe to assume that that would probably be likely and could be a risk factor in prolonging these species coming back. But avian flu is a natural disease in the environment, and they do go through these peaks and troughs. So hopefully, fingers crossed, that it will sort itself out. Yeah.
One final question. How do they get on with kites and crows?
Oh, good question. So with kites, they are, like I said, they are both scavenging species, so they will have an interaction within the environment. I know, for example, one of our young white-tailed eagles from the Isle of Wight decided to hang out with a group of red kites in the winter in Suffolk. So, I mean, they won't have a detrimental impact on our red kite populations. They have very different dietary requirements. These species thrive next to each other very closely up in Scotland and across Europe. So we do expect to have an interaction with our buzzards and kites, but we don't expect direct competition. We do expect to have some indirect effects just by the mere presence of white-tailed eagles being the most dominant species. There could be, for example, a bit of kerfuffle over carcasses. So, you know, red kites are now kind of going around the Welsh landscape being the largest birds of prey on the wing. So they're, you know, enjoying being kind of top of the food chain. But like I said, with white-tailed eagles coming back in, they would, that white-tailed eagles would be the most dominant prey in, dominant birds of prey in that given setting. So, you know, there'd definitely be some kerfuffles over carcasses, but definitely something that's needed, I think, in the Welsh landscape.
I suppose the point is they're all native species and they've all lived side by side over millennia kind of thing. So it should all, you know, reach a natural balance again. Even
with the likes of COVID, you know, we've shown that white-tailed eagles do actually reduce some of the activities of some of these pest species. So for example, gull species, rats, you know, so corvids, ravens, they do actually have, just their mere presence has an influence on the way that these species act, because, you know, it's just restoring that order of dominance through the food chain. So they just act a little bit more cautious, you know, in areas that have their more natural predators. So it kind of reduces their activity slightly. So yeah.
Okay, right, thank you very much. So we shall look forward to hearing updates on this at various points, and hopefully in a few years' time there'll be the eagles for everybody to see. Right, so I think thank you, Sophie Lee, and I think we thank Cherry and Derek, Sophie Lee again. I'm going to thank myself as well, and thank you, Larry, for organising stuff, and thank you for you all coming along today. That's great. And as I said, if anybody has had their site resurveyed quite a while and would like it doing, then get in touch with me, please. And basically, Thank you very much.